Good afternoon, and welcome to River Landing Conversations. I'm Kay Heflin, here with my co-host Jim Kalacki. Since 1963, the governors of North Carolina have reserved their highest award, the longleaf pine, for those special individuals who have made significant contributions to their communities and our state. In 2022, one of our residents, Harvey received this honor, and we thought that we would definitely like to get to know him, and I'm sure you would too. So welcome, Harvey. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
We know that some of the contributions you made were here in the city of High Point. Is this where your life story began?
No, my life story begins in New England. I was born and raised in Salem, Massachusetts. Went to school in New England, just outside of Boston, where I met my gorgeous wife. And we got married our senior year. So New England is my beginning. I tell people from North Carolina that they say, well, how did you get here? First response is, of course, I drove my car. That's how I got here. But I got here out of choice. And a lot of those choices were around work. But North Carolina is my adopted home, and I'd love to be here. I've had the chance to go back to New England. My two brothers are in New England. I choose to stay in North Carolina.
Okay, good. How long have you been here?
We've been here a couple times.
Okay.
Early in my career, I was a chemical engineer by profession, and then ended up getting an MBA along the way. And my first visit was in the early 70s when I was starting with the first company. I worked for 3 different corporations. It was called GAF Corporation, and their chemical division was in Charlotte, and then got transferred around the country. My wife and I had this argument about whether we transferred 10 times or 11 times. I think it's 11, but she's not sure. And then the second time was in back to South Carolina, and that was in the late 80s. And then I started to work here in High Point in 1990 when I was asked to come and work for one of the chemical companies here. The company I came to work for here was actually a family originated company in High Point called High Point Chemical by the Stevens family. They had sold their company a year before I joined to the Japanese corporation of Kao Corporation. Kao is similar to Procter & Gamble is here in the United States, where a lot of personal care products, but they also have a chemical entity. And I ended up taking over as president and CEO for 20 years, right there at Kao.
Is that company still here in High Point?
They are. I moved on. I retired when I was 60, which was early-ish. But my wife and I decided while we still had good health, then we had enough financial backing that we could go ahead and retire, and I did. And that really started me on a new venture. I had done, probably like a lot of corporate people, you end up getting on the board for United Way or Red Cross, and I did those sorts of things while I was working. But I decided when I retired, I wasn't ready to just sit down. I still had a lot of energy. I felt like I had some skill sets that maybe I could be used. And I have this love for High Point where I really wanted to give back to the community. So it started me working as a volunteer for a number of the nonprofits here in town. I also started a consulting business when I first retired for 5 or 6 years, but it felt like work. So I kind of let that dwindle down and began to concentrate on some of the nonprofit opportunities that were available to me. But in the meantime, there were other things. Church, I've always gotten really active with our church and got on committees, and they always need volunteers. So it was an evolution that eventually brought me, I'm going to go back to the longleaf pine.
Okay.
I ended up, when you are awarded the longleaf pine, and let me pause on that for just a minute because it was an unexpected award that I received. The High Point Community Foundation are the ones that submitted my name and application, and I'll get back to that. But it's an honor. I try to be humble. I think I'm humble. But when I look at some of the other names that are on the list, and a couple of them I pulled off here, you basketball people probably will know that Dean Smith and Coach K are both on the list. But there are other people that make it very humbling for me. Jeff Gordon, Andy Griffin, Billy Graham, Dale Earnhardt, Bob Timberlake, Nito Cobain over at HBU is on that list. We actually have two other members here in River Landing that have been given the Longleaf Pine Award. One is Tom Sears, who lives over in Caldwell
Okay.
Village. Tom was a dental surgeon. He ended up, I think, organizing a couple groups to go down to Africa and help the people down there with their dental issues. And the other person in 2007 was Bill McGuinn, also a long-term High Point native who was awarded the Longleaf Pine. There may be others. Those are just the two that I know of.
It's an amazing list to go through.
It is.
Yes.
And you know, to think that you're in that echelon, I'm not worthy. So it was quite a humbling award to receive. Back to Community Foundation, I ended up initially volunteering with Community Foundation through, again, a nonprofit contact. Part of the Community Foundation, they have a committee called the Heart of High Point. The Heart of High Point's job is really to grant out money to nonprofits if it's an emergency need only. The Community Foundation also grants, but not necessarily just for emergencies. But this group, this Heart of High Point, only does emergencies. So if a nonprofit loses an air conditioner, or the plumbing goes bad, or a computer dies on them, then the Heart of High Point will receive an application. They have to be vetted. They have to make sure that it's a viable nonprofit and it's got 501(c) status and it has been audited on a regular basis. But what happened to me as I was partnering with one of the nonprofits is like, well, why don't you have money in your normal budget for an air conditioner? You know they're not going to last forever, so why aren't you submitting that? And what hit me around that whole conversation was that from a business point of view, I would think about those things. And maybe even running your own household, you think about those things. And I don't mean to slam anybody in the nonprofit community because I love them. They normally are very passionate people. They're not necessarily good business people.
Right.
They don't understand what it may take to allow this organization to have a lifespan of 25 years or more. So in many cases, their heart really gets out in front of them. So I think they need somebody else to come along, and usually it's somebody on the board who says, no, from a business point of view, maybe you ought to think about putting a replacement for the air condition or the plumbing or whatever it might be that eventually is going to have a life of needing to be replaced. So that really started me. Eventually it then became part of the Community Foundation, was in their finance group for a while, and eventually was asked to be chairman for 2 years. And it was right in the COVID period, my stance as chairman. While I was chairman, Paul Lassard, who is the president, the executive director, president there at Community Foundation, he wanted to do a short piece on me. So do you have your bio available? Again, I went in my computer, searched it, and humbly handed it to him. I'm like, oh, here it is. And he looked at it and he said, whoa, what's all this other stuff? He said, I knew that you were involved with, in this case, West End Ministries, which is a nonprofit, or Open Door Ministry, another nonprofit here in High Point. He said, I didn't realize all this other stuff. So we had a long conversation about that. What I didn't know is what Paul eventually did is applied for the application for the Longleaf Pine. So that was really the genesis of it. And it was a surprise in December when was awarded that at one of their meetings.
Harvey, I was smiling as you were talking inwardly because I could totally relate to what you're saying about people running organizations with their hearts and not with their business head. Because I think I was one of those hearts once upon a time, and we didn't have you on a board somewhere, but we had people like you. And I say, God, why are you asking such hard questions? But absolutely got to appreciate and love that perspective because it's so important in keeping good organizations afloat.
And what I discovered myself, and you probably found it yourself, you didn't necessarily want to go to the administrative side of it because you can see the need of the nonprofit.
And it's easier to raise money, to ask people for money that's going to be used directly for that organization's cause rather than for plumbing air conditioners, yeah.
Conversely, if you had put me as the executive director and I'm out there trying to serve these people, I wouldn't have done a good job at that.
Yeah.
My heart is not that open
Yeah.
to people's needs. And yet I'm willing to sit back on the sideline and say, well, okay, you need some support. And maybe between the two of us, we can make this thing really
Work together.
That's why we
Yep.
need to figure out how to talk with each
Have
other.
all sorts of brains working together,
Yeah.
yes.
You know, team can do a lot more.
Indeed.
It really
Indeed.
can.
Could we go back to Salem and your young days for a while and tell us a little bit about what growing up in Salem, Massachusetts was like and what you remember of fond memories that you have?
I have a lot of fond memories of Salem. I was one of three boys. God bless my mother. I was the youngest. My dad was a pediatrician in Salem. One of the things that happened, as typically many of you, maybe if you're third in your family or fourth or whatever, you realize that there are times that you get to be the object, not necessarily welcome object of your older siblings. And I was. I had two athletic, vivacious brothers. But at one point, and I think I'm 6, 8 years old or whatever it was, my dad had this chart of growth over time, you know, weight and height and bones and all that sort of thing. And he went to my two brothers and said, you may want to pull it back a little bit, guys, because this guy is going to be a little bit bigger. So I don't know that helped, but it probably helped a little. Had a wonderful childhood. Did a lot of athletics, and like many of us back when we were raised at that period, we didn't have computer games to play, so we were making up games and having fights with chestnuts in Salem, Massachusetts, or snowballs or whatever it might be, and playing football and pickup basketball and all that sort of thing. So it was a really, really nice life. We spent our summers, my parents had a little cottage on the coast of Maine, which got bigger as we got older. But it's probably similar to here in the Carolinas. You go out to the beach and people have a small cottage and spend their summers there. That was really a wonderful time in my life as well.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for it, my dad worked hard, but when he would go on vacation in the summertime, we really got to see another personality, another side of my dad. So we did the hunting and fishing, not so much hunting, but fishing and a lot of sailing. One of my passions in life is sailing, and I owe that to my parents.
Whereabouts in Maine did you?
It's up on the coast north of Boothbay Harbor. It's a place called Pemaquid.
Yes.
Pemaquid Point. And it's actually on the quarter, the ceremonial quarter that they put out. The lighthouse that is on the quarter is Pemaquid.
That's amongst my favorite places.
Is it?
I lived and worked in Maine for a bunch of years, and going back there is such a treat in the summer.
In the summer. My oldest brother actually lives in Pemaquid or New Harbor.
And
I always call him, usually in January, February, when we have one of those beautiful 65-degree days down here. I'll zoom, make sure that he can see me on the camera and say, how's the weather up there? And I'm already researching. I know what the weather is like up there. So we do have fun with each other.
And where did you go to college then?
I went to Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. My family, my two brothers and father and actually grandfather had all gone to Dartmouth College. And of course, there was some pressure to do that. But I was at that point in my life where I was wanting to spread my own wings.
Yes.
So even though I got accepted at Dartmouth, I ended up going to Tufts University. Part of the reason was playing football. I enjoyed football a lot. I suspected I had a better chance at Tufts to play than I did at Dartmouth. So that was the other thing that led me to go to Tufts. But it was a really good choice for me. It allowed me some independence, kind of taking a stance with my dad. But I was able to play sports. There was a point, and this is the end of my sophomore year. I'm not the world's best student. I work hard at my grades, but grades weren't doing really well. So I had one of those sit downs that you have with your parents. My dad asked me the question, are you going to become a professional footballer or are you going to become an engineer to make your livelihood? I thought, he's got a point. So I ended up giving up football, but I stayed on with lacrosse for a while. Went back to the studies.
I remember Tufts has got world-renowned School of Diplomacy.
Yes, it does.
And also, if I'm correct? A
Dental.
vet school
Dental school
and a vet school.
and a vet school,
Yeah.
all of them.
Because I remember in Maine, there was no veterinary school in Maine or in several other New England states, and there were places at Tufts for people from Maine. I always thought it was a very interesting arrangement, but the School of Diplomacy is,
It's world known.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really quite a thing.
When did you and Jan move here to River Landing?
December 3rd, 19. So a little over 3 years now. Caldwell Village. So the whole Caldwell Village, I think within 2 months, we all arrived at about the same
Right.
time. So we have formed pretty tight relationships, I think, with the Caldwell folk. One of the things that happened as COVID was beginning to impact us all,
Yes.
and I think it was that era where you need to wear face masks, no more than 10 people in a gathering, that
Yes.
sort of thing. I was talking with one of my neighbors in Caldwell, and he said, I'm getting cabin fever. I feel like I'm being isolated. I didn't react immediately, but my response eventually was to invite 9 other men in Caldwell Village around our neighborhood on Friday mornings at 10 o'clock, bring coffee or beverage of your choice. To 10 o'clock in the morning, for me, it would be my second cup of coffee, but, to sit out on the driveway. So I think this was probably in March, April, the first time we met. And it continued for a couple Friday mornings, and we would cover the waterfront. We tried not to spend a lot of time in politics, but we were all getting familiar with what was going on at River Landing and did a lot of sharing about that. Well, then the women got jealous, so eventually we ended up with the women on the back porch, and my wife was hosting them, and I was hosting the guys in the garage, or when it got cold, we were inside the garage. We continue that today. So it has survived COVID. We continue to look forward to Friday mornings and having another cup of coffee and solving the world's problems there in Caldwell Village.
I think that's been one nice thing about Caldwell and the hybrids. All of you came in new at one time
Right.
and were able to establish friendships more easily, perhaps,
I think
because
so.
of that need at that point, especially during COVID,
I think
when you
so.
couldn't reach out to other people as much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has been a great decision to come up here to River Landing. We've enjoyed every minute of it.
What are your favorite activities here at River Landing now?
Other than pickleball? No. I enjoy pickleball a lot. And I ended up getting a knee replacement 6 months ago. And as that was being done, the physical therapist said, well, what are your goals in getting this knee replaced? And I said, well, to get back on the pickleball court. So even today, when I see the therapists working over in the gym and I'm on the pickleball court, it's kind of like, I got here. And I'm also on the scholarship committee.
Okay.
I've enjoyed that here as well. And those are the 2 activities. Not that I couldn't do more, but I'm not sure I have the time. I continue to do a lot in High Point to this day. So at some point as that begins to ratchet down, I'll probably look into it a little bit more at River Landing. And I just want to go back to some of those other activities, because it was not just nonprofits that I ended up spending time with. One of the things that is heartfelt for me at church, had a good friend who at the age of 62 was developing Alzheimer's. So he's one of those early
Onsets.
Alzheimer's folk. And within 2 years, it was getting really difficult for him. So I ended up at church forming a group, and there was maybe 12 or 14 of us that would meet every other week. And you were either a caretaker or you were a person who had Alzheimer's, to get together for an hour or two just to share what's going on in your life. Do you need any help? How's your caretaker doing if it's not present here? So that was really something that I think was helpful. We talked a lot about what is there ever going to be a cure? What are some of the medical issues around Alzheimer's? And there was a lot of sharing about, I ended up with this problem, but this is how I solved it. And everybody else is kind of taking mental notes like,
Sure.
Okay, maybe I'll try that as well. So I felt like that was a worthy cause, and have gone on to do that. My wife and I also have been actively involved with United States Naval Academy. Our daughter ended up going to the Naval Academy and graduating in 2008. The admissions to get into the Naval Academy, you have to talk with a local person who is connected with the admissions office. They're called blue and gold officers.
Good.
So as a high school student, you apply, and then they ask you to sit and talk with these blue and gold officers, and that's what my wife and I were. So we would have an interview that might last 2 hours with prospective candidates, trying to let them understand what the academy is all about, and some of the good and bad things about the academy to make sure that it was going to be a good choice for them. And we did that for 12 or 13 years. The upside of it, you get to really meet some wonderful, wonderful young people.
Sure.
I mean, they're just, you want to say to all of them, yes, go to the
Sure.
academy. It's worthy. And of course, they all don't end
Yeah.
up going to the academy. It's not right for everybody, but it certainly was for a number of people. So that was an enjoyable thing to be involved with. That has morphed, again, through my daughter. She ended up marrying another Navy Academy graduate. There's something called the Honor Foundation, and it was started by the Navy SEAL Foundation, that as these Navy SEALs decide that their military career needs to be over and they want to go out into corporate America someplace and start another career, it's a relatively difficult transition for
Sure.
them. So the Honor Foundation is a matter of taking one of those individuals and putting them with a mentor. And then they give them a 13-week course. How do you write a resume? How do you go through the interview process? And these are things that I never thought about. If you're in the military, you've never asked for a pay increase. You've probably never had to decide what business casual really was.
Yeah.
You haven't had to decide where you're going to have your next meal, really, for the most part. So for them all of a sudden to turn away from this life that they had lived for, in these cases, they're 10 or 20 years that they have been special warfare warriors, to say, okay, this is what the outside world would expect for you. And they have, so it's a 13-week course that they go, I think it is 3 hours twice a week. And then you, as a coach to them, end up talking with them every week and how things go and what can I help you with, and try to let them understand what the outside world is all about. So my daughter had gone through that because she was a helicopter pilot, and she left after her 14 years with the Navy. And she said, Dad, you'd be really good at this. So why don't you go ahead and talk to these people and get hooked up with the Honor Foundation? So I'm doing that still today. Right now, I had done some work with some folks out of Virginia Beach, which is where daughter and her husband and family are. But now I'm working with the folks out of Fort Bragg. So it's the Army, Delta Force, and Rangers and those folks. So, and these are some wonderful, wonderful people. And I'm glad we have warriors like that.
Wow. What a great idea. I'm just sitting here thinking, wishing that I had known you probably, oh my God, 20 years ago, because one of my first doctoral students at the University of New Orleans did a dissertation on the whole exiting process coming out of, I think it was the Army as far as I remember. And a conversation like this at that time would have been so helpful for lots of the people that she was dealing with. And on the other end, I love your thought about how excited you are about meeting people going in, because I find I've done some of that with some other institutions at the same age, and it's just so encouraging to know that there are people like this out there, because often we don't hear about them or meet them, and that, as they say, the future is in their hands, and some of those hands are pretty secure places for the future to be.
Yes. That experience that you have with interviewing the young people to go into the academy certainly transfers well into your work on the scholarship committee.
It helps.
And what an awarding experience that is to see our monies going to such wonderful young people here. Not all young people, but people who want to continue their careers and their education.
I remember people when we first came to River Landing, maybe within the first year or two, they were asking, how are things going and how do you enjoy River Landing? And I said, two surprises for me. One is that the other residents are so friendly.
Mhm.
You know, we're all kind of in that same life stage,
Yeah.
and it's easy for us to relate to each other. And I don't think there's any competition going on. We're just hoping to enjoy each other. But the other part is the staff. I have been amazed, I continue to be amazed how hard they work at making this a family environment for everybody. So those to me were two real big positive surprises. I remember talking to one of the River Landing folk in one of the afternoon or lunches that we were with, and we were not part of River Landing at the time. And he said he and his wife have a competition going on, and that is if we can find a grumpy staff member. We haven't found anyone. He said, I think I have one maybe in mind, but I'm not so sure. But I don't know that either one of them ever found a grumpy staff member. We're blessed to have the
Yes.
people. And a lot of credit to Tom Smith and the job that he's been able to do in leading this organization. Not a job that I would enjoy, but he has done and continues to do a wonderful job. We owe a lot to Tom and his staff.
Yes, absolutely.
I've often thought driving by here on the street out there, and a zillion people, now more than a zillion
Yeah,
people are
zillion.
driving by, but you see the sign River Landing, you think, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I think if a number of people that do that drive knew what was going on here and who was here, that they'd have their socks knocked off.
I think so.
It's just, it's such a rich and diverse intellectually and culturally and so on.
When you go to some of like the chorus performance, and I think,
Yeah,
we got some talented people here. I mean,
indeed.
one other thing that I picked up on, and this has been 3 or 4 years now, when, back when I was chairman of the community foundation, somebody had said there's a new principal coming into Andrews High School. There are two high schools here in High Point, Central and Andrews. A new principal coming in. He had been a principal at a middle school, and he probably needs some help. So I have continued to mentor. His name is Marcus Gauze, and he was in the newspaper recently where he and the principal over at Page, which is in Greensboro, had gone through their master's program together, literally together. They would drive over to Chapel Hill in the same car. And they now have a podcast going out. Marcus is black, Eric Nagel is white, and they had some shared experiences where they got different treatment because of color.
Yep.
So now they've formed an organization, I'm trying to remember the name of it, Great Expectations. I think that's correct. But anyway, they're trying to start a dialogue between blacks and whites to recognize that there's a lot of commonality, and maybe we could figure out a way to treat each other better than we have. So that's to Marcus's credit, but have enjoyed working a lot with Marcus. Just to walk around the campus and see how he treats the students. He tends to want to focus on the students that are below average, where they need perhaps more help and more motivation. But he knows what they're doing. The last tests, he will make sure that they're dressed appropriately. Pull up your pants, guys, and no, we're not wearing hats, and this is school. We don't wear hats, et cetera, et cetera. Again, back to interviewing folks for military academy, you think we got some folks here who are really doing a good job. We ought to look at the bright side of things here.
Harvey, if I could bring up one other thing in your education past that we talked briefly about before we started this conversation. You have a rich association with Lees McRae College, which is one of the small but clearly great gems in education in North Carolina. Tell us a little bit about Lees McRae and your
involvement there. Our son Andrew went to Lees McRae. took him an extra year to get through Lees McRae, but he did graduate in '08. He was a special needs. He's a ADHD child, so he needed some help taking exams, et cetera, et cetera. He found Lees McRae because it's in the mountains, because it is remote. It was the right place for him to be. It was an environment that he could be successful in. Earlier, before he went to Lees McRae, he and I did a lot of backpacking with the Boy Scouts. I found that was an environment that he could be really successful in. He was a good athlete, ended up both he and his sister swimming and becoming All-American swimmers in high school. But Lees McRae was a great place for him. So I fell in love with Lees McRae, and they eventually asked me to join the board, and ultimately ended up being chairman for 4 years there. And I think it was in 14 I did the commencement address. And so I have a real tender spot in my heart for Lees McRae. It's a small school. Today, I think enrollment is under 1,000. It's probably 900. They have active programs. Recently, when I was there, we started the nursing school. They do a lot in the theater arts as well. They do a lot with veterinary, pre-veterinary majors there. But it's in a beautiful place in North Carolina. That one of the things that I really love about North Carolina, if you want the mountains, that's 2 or 3 hours away. If you want to coast to coast, that's 2 or 3 hours away. I mean, it's just,
Indeed.
it's a wonderful spot in this country to live. So,
If you're not from North Carolina and you're looking for a weekend trip or even a day trip, if you get up early, Lees McRae is in the town of Banner Elk, which is very close to Boone and very close to Blowing Rock in the northwest part of the state. And it's absolutely stunningly beautiful country. And
at the base of Beech Mountain, between Beech and Sugar.
Yeah. And if you know the Duns here, you can learn anything and everything you want to about Beech Mountain, because they were residents there for quite a number of years. And but it's a gorgeous part of the country.
Well, one of the questions that we like to ask all of our guests is if the arrangements could be made and you could have some time with anyone, living or dead, who would you like to spend some time with?
I think the question said 3 people, so I've got
Okay,
3.
good. You studied ahead of time.
I thought about this a lot. And I just bear with me on the answer.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people would choose my number 1. My number 1 would be to talk with Jesus Christ. And if he was busy, I'm sure he is, then I would love to talk to his father, Joseph. I've often been amazed at Joseph and what a faith person he was to do what he did. He had 4 conversations with God between Jesus, before Jesus was born, and then when he was asked to go to Egypt and back again. What would it be like to have a son who was a perfect son?
Yeah.
And get a chance to, teach him a craft,
Yeah.
teach him to be a carpenter or whatever. But so if Jesus were busy,
Okay.
then I would like to talk to his father. The second person is Robert E. Lee. I have enjoyed being a student of the Civil War. I have a lot more that I would like to study, but he was also a man of wonderful faith. And I guess a number of battles before the battle, he would pray most of the night long to God's will for the battle and what it had done to this country. So Robert E. Lee is another one that I would like to understand. And one of the things I would really like to understand from him is that he was fighting a war he knew that he was at a huge disadvantage. He didn't have the supplies, he didn't have the money, he didn't have even the numbers that he was competing with. And yet he fought the good fight. He continued to look for a way to make it victorious for him. It didn't work out. But then he turns around, and the rest of his life was on how do I heal this country? He was leading the revolt, if you will.
Yes.
And yet then he was willing, when the game was over, to say, well, how can we come back together? How can we heal these wounds? And eventually went to Washington and Lee, and was the president there for a number of years. He also, I didn't realize this, he had, I think, 4 daughters, and they went over to, what is the golf resort?
St. Andrews?
No, right there in West Virginia.
Oh,
The Greenbrier.
Greenbrier, thank you. That he would spend his summer with his daughters there with the intention of letting them socialize and hopefully find husbands. But
Good place to look.
so anyway, I would like to talk to Robert.
Yeah.
The third person, and this goes back to my love of sailing. I don't know if any of you read a lot of Michener, James Michener. One of the books he wrote was called Chesapeake, and it had to do with Chesapeake Bay. And there's one section in there talking about the Revolutionary War. And there was a character called Matt Turlock, who was a captain of one of the American vessels against the British, and some of the shenanigans that went on, and him getting to have the British chase him, and eventually the British ended up sinking their vessel. But anyway, I would love to talk to a sea captain and find out what that life of square rig ships was all about, and what it would be like to live aboard those ships. And so those would be my 3 people anyway that I think about. Probably a lot of you people wouldn't care to talk about Matt Turlock, but I'd like to talk to Captain Turlock for a while, or somebody else like that.
That's why we like to ask the question, because we come up with really interesting people that we might all like to know more about. Yes.
Yep.
So is there anything we haven't covered in our conversation that you thought we might?
I've enjoyed this conversation. I really have. I have, as you can probably feel, I have a passion for giving back to this community that we've lived in and worked in for a number of years. And High Point has been gracious business-wise and personally to myself and my family. I appeal to folks at River Landing that if you're a little bit bored, there are lots of volunteer opportunities, whether you want to do it through your church or whatever. There's a lot of skills here at River Landing that if you have that desire to want to share some of the God-given talents that you have, then go look for where maybe you can get plugged in and help some other people that, my Christian walk said we ought to help those people in need. So because of the skill set that is here, and if you have that energy, and we don't all have the energy, but if you do, there's a lot that can be done in our community, I think.
Amen.
amen. What a
Yes.
great
Yes.
finish. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for being with
Thanks
us.
for the invitation. It's been wonderful to talk to you both. I've enjoyed it very, very much.
Good. We thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Friday at 3. Thank you.